My wife is the best in the world at many things, but especially in fashion. So she says normally to me, don't wear this or wear that, so I follow her. Before her, I was a disaster. Now I'm elegant thanks to her. All good things in my life are created by others, sometimes from my wife, sometimes from the money we have at clubs. These were the words of undoubtedly the greatest football manager ever, Pep Guardiola, a man who conquered football in ways few ever could. But at home, in matters of the heart, he was simply a man in love, eager to follow the wisdom of the woman who stood beside him. Cristina Serra was not just his wife. She was the silent force behind him, the foundation of the empire he built. Pep and Cristina's love story was one that seemed to defy the odds, the kind that belonged in an old Barcelona painting, timeless, effortless, yet deeply profound. They met when they were just teenagers, when Guardiola, still a budding 18-year-old footballer, walked into Cristina's family's fashion store, Serra Claret, for a modeling gig in 1994. Little did he know that day would change his life forever. It was a love that grew quietly, like Pep's legendary Barcelona team, expertly playing out from the back, not with haste, but with unwavering persistence. They dated long distance as Pep's football career took him across Europe. And despite the fame, despite the wealth, their love remained understated. They didn't rush into marriage. No grand wedding, no extravagant show of affection. Instead, they chose a quiet ceremony where they both arrived in casual clothes, with only as few as 10 people present. This was in 2014, after already building a family together. They had their 3 children, Maria, Marius, and Valentina, long before the rings came. Such was the level of understanding those two had all these years. For years, Cristina was his quiet refuge, away from football's chaos. Whenever Pep achieved greatness, she was there, not in the spotlight, but always present, watching, supporting. Cristina was there that night in Istanbul to celebrate Pep's historic treble with Manchester City in May 2023. Even at that time, because of how close-knit and private the family was, only those in their closest circle knew Cristina and Pep had been living apart for years. But love, no matter how strong, is not immune to time and distance. And for a man like Pep, obsessive, relentless, and incapable of slowing down, there was always the risk of losing the very things he cherished. Reports now suggest that Cristina was the one who decided enough was enough. Her patience, stretched over decades, finally snapped when Guardiola chose to stay in England until 2027 rather than return home to Barcelona as she had hoped. But had this split been years in the making? Back in 2019, Cristina and their youngest daughter, Valentina, quietly moved back to Spain to settle in an $8.4 million home in the upmarket Barcelona neighborhood of Pedralbes, a home the couple purchased in 2021. At the time, it seemed like a decision rooted in her business interests. After all, she was an entrepreneur, deeply invested in her fashion empire, the very family business she inherited from her grandparents. But now, with hindsight, the question lingers. Was Cristina already preparing her exit? Had she already made peace with the idea that their lives were heading in different directions? Or was it Guardiola's obsession with perfection that finally drove the wedge too deep? To understand Pep Guardiola, you must understand the way he works. He does not coach a team. He lives, breathes, and suffers for it. This is the man who, during Manchester City's end-of-year crisis, locked himself in the club's offices for days, refusing to leave, obsessing over every detail. The same man who also kept his players from going on Christmas holidays last December because he couldn't stand their poor form. This is the manager who, without hesitation, could call his players at dawn to discuss tactics. Imagine, then, what his marriage must have felt like. Imagine being the wife of a man who could spend sleepless nights analyzing football, but perhaps failed to analyze the distance growing between him and the woman he loved. When Manchester City struggled towards the end of 2024, losing to Juventus in the Champions League, falling to Manchester United at home, and suffering a miserable defeat to Aston Villa, Guardiola's frustration was evident. He cut a tense and nervous figure after a game against Feyenoord, even joking that City's poor form had driven him to self-harm. The pressure was mounting, not just on the pitch, but at home too. Amid this storm, however, Guardiola did something unusual. He left Manchester and traveled to Barcelona. Not for football, not for tactics, but for something far more personal. He met with Cristina at Bodega Sepulveda, his favorite restaurant in the city. But this was no romantic getaway. Onlookers described the meeting as tense. They sat in the corner, speaking animatedly, with none of the warmth that had once defined their bond. Cristina wanted him to leave England, to return home, to finally choose family over football. Perhaps she felt, after all these years, it was now Pep's time to choose her for his job for once. But her timing could have been much, much better, dare I say. You see, Pep Guardiola is not a man who walks away from a challenge. Now more than ever, Pep felt the need to prove himself, to turn Manchester City's fortunes around. He even once vowed to the English press that he would do just that, accepting responsibility for all Manchester City's bad fortunes. And so, instead of following Cristina back to Barcelona, he flew back to Manchester. And in November, he made a statement, signing a new 2-year contract that would keep him at City until at least 2027. It was a decision that confirmed his priorities, one that may have sealed his fate with Cristina. "I wouldn't have forgiven myself if I left City in these circumstances," he admitted, after Manchester City's improved form in the last month. And just like that, the man who had once built a life with Cristina had chosen his club over his home. But before you question what kind of man would choose football over family, consider this. Guardiola has always prioritized his family. In May 2023, after winning the historic treble, he took Cristina and their children on a dream vacation to Egypt. It was his way of showing that despite his obsession with football, his family came first. Around the same time, Pep explained his personal life schedule. "When I have 5 days off, for example, yes, I can switch off from football. I went to Barcelona after Real Madrid, for example, to see my wife, my little daughter. That helps me. But every 3 days, there's no chance." And yet, despite all of this, Cristina has still walked away. With reports now emerging that Cristina is looking to claim 50% of Pep's over $100 million fortune, the question becomes even more unsettling. You know, Pep and Cristina had been together for over 20 years, yet strangely, she only moved out of their home 5 years after officially becoming his wife. For 2 decades, she stayed by his side, unofficially. No marriage certificate, no legal bindings. But then, in 2014, they made it official, and 5 years later, she was gone. That smells fishy. I mean, for a wife of over 3 decades, we should not take for granted the fact that Cristina actually wanted Pep to leave England during his lowest ever managerial moment, knowing perfectly well that Pep was never the man to run from a challenge. No, there's only one reality that dawns over all this, that it was always Cristina's calculation that whenever it came down to it, Pep would choose his football, and that knowledge alone has been her get-out-of-jail-free card to walk away. Pay no attention to talks of her wanting to concentrate on her family's fashion business as the reason for the split. I mean, if you were an established fashion business owner at 52 and married to a loyal multi-millionaire of a husband, the last thing you'd ever so desperately think about is separation to focus on your business. What really is there to focus on again other than making your family work? This takes us back to earlier conversations surrounding their divorce settlement. Did Cristina con Pep into making their union official for this very reason? Did she wait until she could legally take half before finally walking away? Or was this simply the inevitable end of a love story that had run its course? And now, as Pep Guardiola stands at the helm of Manchester City, with the echoes of his family's absence lingering behind him, the question remains, where does Pep Guardiola go from here?